Our infrastructure and natural resources can't keep up with growing demands. We need to be smarter. We need to care more. It's time to create smart infrastructure. We can because we connect energy systems, buildings, and industries to adapt and evolve the way we live and work for the good of the planet and the people. Creating environments that care. Smart infrastructure from Siemens.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Bloomberg's Smart Cities 2.0, part of a series of events that we are doing on the subject of, well, smart cities. My name is Nate Lanxon. I'm an editor at Bloomberg News, and I'm joining you virtually today. Smart cities are something we've been talking about for a number of years now, but it's a topic that may get a fresh impetus from the COVID-19 pandemic, given the need for more intelligent infrastructure and for it to be adaptable to deal with this so-called new normal. We're going to cover buildings as well as transportation and society and a range of other topics. And we've got some speakers with fascinating insight. I spoke to them all ahead of this event, and trust me, they know what they're talking about. But just before we begin, I'd like to recognize our sponsor for today's event, Siemens, and draw your attention to a white paper that it's produced that focuses on smart buildings. You'll find this paper within a window called Handouts in the second tab of the Q&A window, where you can download a PDF version of it. I'd also like to welcome our community from across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, as well as Asia, and say hello to the thousands of listeners tuning in across social media and via the Bloomberg terminal. Also, please make sure you're using Firefox or Chrome. These tend to work best with our streaming platform, and refresh the browser, of course, if you have any issues with sound. That usually fixes most problems. You can also restore the layout of the windows using the buttons at the bottom of your screen, and each of those windows is adjustable. So if you want to make me smaller and a guest larger, you can do that. And there will be opportunities throughout this conversation for real-time input from you. We'd love you to post your highlights and any of your favorite quotes or learnings to social media, and encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. And you can do that using the handles Bloomberg Live or @Business. And I do encourage you to submit questions in the little text box at the bottom right of your screen, including your first name, if possible, and your city when asking a question. And we'll also invite you to vote in live polling, which will appear in the polling box. So let's start with our first panel of speakers. Joining us this morning, we have Cedric Nika, who is the CEO of Siemens Smart Infrastructure. Good morning, Cedric.
Morning, Nate. Great to see you in a big box, actually.
Thank you. We also have Dr. Marianne Reeb, who is a futurologist and manager of society and mobility pioneering at Mercedes-Benz. Good morning, Marianne.
Hello to everyone. Hi.
And I'm also delighted to introduce Eric Perucane, who is VP of Connectivity at Airbus. Good morning, Eric. So the coronavirus pandemic has highlighted how the use of sensors can be the key to resilience in our cities, whether it's using wearables to monitor distance from others or a sensor for contactless temperature measurement. Sensors are going to continue to grow in importance, of course, and they were already crucial in cities for monitoring things like air quality, for example. I was reading a report from Bloomberg Intelligence actually just last night that said over 80% of city dwellers are exposed to air pollution levels that exceed standards set by the World Health Organization. So sensors could help us mitigate associated risks better in future. And I'll be speaking with the author of that BI report a little later. Let's start with a quick poll, though. I want to know what our audience thinks about smart cities, because I've been covering this for about 15 years, and I feel like I've predicted the smart city revolutions several times before. So I want to answer the question, what's different now? So here's the question that you can vote on in the box on your screen. Do you have confidence that a smart city revolution is any more possible in the next decade than the last? And the answers are definitely possible now, no more so than the last decade, or you're not confident that anything is different this time at all. So hopefully you can answer those in the box down there. So while we wait for the results to come in, let's start the conversation. And I'd like to start with Cedric and pose a similar question if I can, actually. And maybe let's focus on buildings specifically. What do property developers and city planners consistently fail to make smart when constructing offices and housing, for example?
Yeah, I mean, the main data, that's a good question. The interesting part is probably the construction industry is the least digitalized industry which exists at the moment. And so therefore, it's also often not smart because people which are building and developing houses and sites and offices are actually not the same people which are operating them. And 80% of the energy is wasted, the costs are in the lifetime of a building. So this silos which exist between the people which are planning the building, the people which are constructing the building, the people which are utilizing the building, mean that most of the energy in buildings are wasted. Currently, I think more than half of the energy or resources which are in the building are completely wasted. And we need to change that. And it's changing for two reasons. One is because we become much more aware of not wasting resources, and two, because technology enables us to do so.
And Marianne, let me ask you just a question as our automotive representative here from Mercedes-Benz. Many observers have said that the pandemic's forcing of cars off the road gave us a chance to reset the roads somewhat and repopulate them with smarter vehicles or infrastructure. Is that happening?
What actually is happening, what you already can see, is that there are a lot of pop-up bike lanes, for example. But I think in the next step, there will be possibilities to make our infrastructure more smart. What is the main condition for smarter traffic and smarter mobility in the cities? Probably we will have sensors in infrastructure which will communicate with cars and other participants in traffic, and so sometime traffic and traffic management will become much more smart in sense. So traffic will come when it's needed. You will be able to tell people which lane they should use in the best case, and so. So I think we have the chance, but what you should think of is that infrastructure rebuilding takes a lot of time, especially in European cities, which are old cities which are built. It's different in Asian cities which are built up newly, and we will see time gap between the newly built cities and the old ones, where it takes a lot of money and a lot of time to rebuild infrastructure. But the chance is good at the moment.
And Eric, I know that obviously with airplanes, it's not quick to update a plane with new hardware, and I'd like to come to what's changing in that field. But can you give us a context of sort of how smart an Airbus aircraft is today in terms of its sensors and the kind of things that it's helping passengers and obviously pilots monitor during a flight?
Yeah, and the context is quite close to the building. When you build a new building, you can do whatever you want. But when you realize that, for example, out of the 10,000 Airbus aircraft flying in the world, 80% is currently not digitally native, that have been designed in the 80s or in the 90s. So our last A350 aircraft, which is our brand new aircraft, has been built as a digital native, and aircraft is a very complex machine, and this aircraft is producing more than 400,000 information per second, and even more. So when you gather all this information, it's terabytes and terabytes. Whereas at the same time, the 320s were collecting 400 information only. So as part of this revolution, which has started also in Airbus, we are now implementing in quick retrofit time or quick modification of flying fleet, some modification in order to bring these 400 parameters up to 24,000 parameters with the same aircraft. And we can use it now, all this massive amount of information with our latest Skywise data analytics platform that we have put in place a few years ago. And guess what? With all this in the lounge with the aircraft having a problem, with all the access of all these new sensors, this is, I hope, something that will come for the past, and then in the future, at least the promise is there that we want to remove all these aircraft on ground conditions.
Well, we'll come back to that in a couple of moments. I just wanted to turn our attention back to the polling results, if we can just bring those up. I'd asked you how confident you were that the smart city revolution is any more possible now than we've said it would be in the past decade. And overwhelmingly, as I'm sure our experts here will be pleased to hear, the confidence is remarkably high. 80% of you think it is definitely possible that we will have a smarter cities overall in the next decade compared to previous decades. 2% of people are not confident at all. So I think maybe our job for the rest of this session is to convince that 2% the difference that is really happening. So let's just say, just stay briefly on aircraft, because I just wanted to come back to one key point about updating technology on a plane. What's like a good example of a specific technology enabled by sensors on an aircraft that maybe before the pandemic was less necessary?
Maybe let's start with a funny example.
Cedric, we are not Cedric. Sorry,
Eric.
Eric.
I can't hear, it's a joke, and I was hoping for the joke to come across, but it's been sort of cut out.
Sorry, Eric.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you again now. If you could restart the answer to your question, that would be helpful.
Yeah. So this was a good teaser for the joke anyway. So yeah, the joke is about new information about the toilets. When you are in an aircraft and when you perform long flights, sometimes you go to the toilets. We should avoid the queuing and being too close from the others. And so we are putting in place some sensors that we can install very rapidly on the aircraft, in order that the people on their smartphone can see the queuing for the toilets. And this is something that we need to go fast in implementing fast on the aircraft. So it's just one example. And then we have many other examples. Another example is also about food and beverage. Instead of having, for example, a cabin crew coming in the aisle with to have some kind of inventory management as part of the process of delivering food. And with your smartphone, you can order directly your beer or your whatever you want to eat. You can pay with your smartphone, so no contact with the outside of your seat, and the cabin crew will just deliver it to you. And for this, we need sensors, we need new information coming inside the aircraft. And our duty is to make it fast, because the market is expecting this very rapidly. And I'm just right in the middle of a hackathon with Airbus and airlines and also application developer to make it happen very, very quick.
Well, we're going to have to check back in with that as that progresses. As someone who takes a lot of flights and orders a lot of drinks on them, the toilet situation sounds like a smart use of technology. Cedric, I just wanted to come back to you on this topic of sensors in buildings back on land. Obviously, building an entirely new complex, whether that's an office or housing or commercial, it seems like it's probably easier to build a building smart from the ground up. But is that the case, or is actually retrofitting existing buildings easier than I think it is?
When it's always easier to build things from scratch, as Eric was saying. If you build a new building, you make it digitally native. What you actually do is you build a digital twin of a plane, or you build a digital twin of a building, and then you install the infrastructure. But since there's a lot of buildings which are not smart, right? I mean, 90% of all, or 99% of all infrastructure is not smart. So if you're going into your building, the building has no idea that you're coming in. It's heating anyway, it's putting the lights on anyway, independently of you knowing that. So I liked Eric's idea, because we're doing exactly the same on the building side. We are retrofitting with sensors. We're building a mesh of sensors so that the building starts to sense you. And why did we do this originally? Not only for the toilets, but we did it basically because we wanted to make sure that you went into a building and you would be granted automatic access control. We wanted to make sure that you knew where your colleagues were, so you could actually book a room. We wanted to know which temperature you like, so when you book a meeting room, the temperature would be sort of exactly make you feel comfortable. So we were building sensors, meshed sensors, and an application so that the building would learn more and more about you, so it would waste less resources. Now, one thing happened with, and you haven't talked about COVID, everybody talks about COVID, but the problem was that we were trying to build technology to bring people closer together in the buildings and reduce wastage. 30% of all office space is not used. And boom, you now have basically COVID, and you want to keep people safe apart when they come back to the building. So we use the same technology to do exactly what Eric was describing. No, we don't use it for toilets yet. We were looking more at elevators, so we didn't want everybody to rush in the same elevator in COVID times, but to say, when can you get in? We wanted to make sure that you would be safely put apart in the building, so that you sit at least at 1.5 meters to 2 meters apart. So what I was trying to say is we were retrofitting buildings with sensors and application to build a platform which makes the whole building adaptable. It knows when it needs to pull people together, and it knows when to keep people apart to be able to do so. And I think that's what we mean about smart, is to be able not only to save energy, but to react to different situations depending on when these situations hit. And it's a lot of technology goes into it.
Well, I want to turn to Marianne, if I can, now, to talk a little bit about the need for collaboration, because I know that that's something that you're very passionate about, is the need for cities and companies and the public maybe as well to actually be talking to make these kinds of wholesale citywide changes to actually happen. Maybe you could talk us through your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Thank you for this question. We used to talk to a lot of cities all over the world to find out what do they mean if they say they have a smart city strategy, and what does it mean. What we found out, there were different phases. The first was very technology driven. The colleague from Siemens is talking about, and we need this whole IoT. But if you don't find the people who use them, and they will use it, it brings them an advantage, it's of use for them, it won't work. We saw smart cities in China. They were built up with every sensor you can imagine. Everything was connected. Totally smart homes, but no one wanted to live there because they forgot that living means more than being connected and being smart. So what we learned out of it, you have to take the people with you. If they accept, if they feel enriched in their life, if they feel supported, they will use technology. And this is really the precondition that smart cities, smart homes, smart mobility will work. What we found out additionally was that it will not be one player, one company that makes the city smart. It needs a lot of players. It needs the three of us in this call, in this conference this morning, for example. It needs the cities, but also citizens all work together on the solutions. We do those things. Small projects here in Stuttgart, for example. We have a large project in Berlin called Future Living Berlin, where we do research on how smart home and smart mobility has to be connected. The sensors in the apartment, how Can they prepare for in-home delivery or something like that? So there are a lot of connections between all these topics, and therefore collaboration between all players and stakeholders is the precondition for success.
Nate, Mariana said something super important. It's not only about the adaptability, but the human centricity. I just don't want to lose that point. Whatever we're going to do has to be human centric. It has to put the person at the center of a building, of a plane, or of a car environment. And if we don't do that, we're missing. And I know Gus is coming next, and we need to make sure that this, of course, is done with right data privacy. Because there's certain elements which are technically feasible, there's certain elements which are legal, but we need to see what is ethical. So this idea of putting sensors as much as possible, putting the person at the center, the human at the center of a city, a building, a car, and making sure that we do it with protecting their privacy is going to be the most important element, which we need to all as a group achieve.
Well, we've got
what you say, because a passenger, somebody living in a building, then will take this car up to the airport and take the aircraft. And even more than centricity, we need to have a continuity in all his travel, and sharing data and breaking the silos between all the verticals in a standard way is super important also for the user centricity and to deliver value to the person.
Well, that's great. I mean, thank you both for chiming in on that point. That's really interesting, and we are going to come on to a little more of that in the next session with my colleague Stephanie. I wanted to just put one broad question to all three of you before we turn to an audience question, and it is quite broad. And I'll start with Cedric, and we'll work down the line, as it were. And I'm really curious to understand when you're sitting in your meetings and on your Zoom calls, and you're talking about the biggest challenges, the biggest obstacles to putting in practice a lot of the things that we've been talking about this morning. What are those main obstacles? What is stopping us really from having all the kinds of sensors everywhere like we've been talking about? And do you have a solution for how you're going to get over that in the sort of the next 2 to 3 years? Cedric, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, and if you talk about smart cities, the bigger you build something, the more difficult it gets, because fundamentally efficiency is gained by breaking down silos. And a city is just a perfect example. It has different silos. It has an energy grid. It has a transportation. It has a car. It might have an airport and planes. And all these things are not connected. So there's huge wastages because we don't connect all of these energy sources and all of these sort of resources which are being sort of used. So the main idea of making something happen, because digitally and putting sensors in, a lot is feasible, and we're proving it, right? We have 3.5 million sensors out. It generates 145 terabit of data every day, but we've put it in. Now the key thing is and that's where I really like what Eric was saying, and Mariana also, is we need to make sure that we think of it holistically. And I'm really struggling with this, because most mayors I talk to don't have the decision power to actually decide on how to break this down. So we need to come back to something which makes sense and try to solve user problems. So for example, we're rebuilding a part of Berlin called Siemens City. It's 100 years old, and we're going to retrofit it to make it the greenest and the most integrated, a bit the vision Marianne was describing, on which the mobility, the housing, the production, all would get integrated. So what we need is to break down those silos technically and then bring the players together to build a holistic approach. Because I started with it. If you have 20 different players which each optimize for themselves, this will never happen. We need to think holistically, we need to bring the people together, and we need to use that technology. And that's why it's so important that I'm here with my mobility colleagues on this call, because this is a big thing. Is we will only be able to reduce CO2 if we take green energy, store it in buildings, and release it to cars at the right time. It's not about just making e-cars which are then charged with coal, right? That doesn't help. So this interaction is super important. And my request is, the more we think on building groups which are able to solve a complete problem, the more we will have a shot at actually making it a reality.
Well, let's move then to Marianne, because I saw you nodding and agreeing there. Maybe you could continue that answer yourself with your knowledge.
Yes, I agree. I thought of the example charging the car in home and charging home with the car would be interesting use case at sometimes. For example, I think really everyone has to come to the trip. You need the cities, and this is new for them. They are not customers of Siemens, either for mobility or buses, or something like that. They are partners for us since some years to develop the really best solutions for a city, and every city is different, for example. So you really have to partner with them and work together on this. And you need cities and infrastructure for sensors on the one side. You need the people who build houses and so on, and everyone has to not to optimize, and this is what Cedric said, not optimize his own system alone, but it has to work together. If it does not work together, you will not have a smart city at the end.
And can I just pass this over to Eric, just briefly for the final point before we turn to a very quick audience question. We're talking major challenge and the solution to that challenge.
And the major challenge, so I agree with what Cedric and Marianne have said. I've seen also two others. The one about citizen acceptance about all this solution. Acceptance to be able to share the data they generate for the benefit maybe of the city, for the benefit of the group, which I think is a key challenge. And behind that, you have the law, you have all the GDPR type of topics. So this is really key. That we installed, hundreds of sensors we install. With the energy that we need to power, with the energy, all this data will have to be for the servers and so on, versus the sustainability. Very often you see that at the beginning you bring billions of data, and at the end you use maybe 1,000 of data to manage efficiently something. So we'll have to find also the right balance for.
I think we just lost you a little bit at the end there, but I think most of that came through. So thank you. Just very, very quickly, we've got an audience question that I'd like to look at that's just come up here. This question, I'm afraid I don't have a name from this person. Apologies, but the question is: what changes or new paradigms do you envisage with the growth of work from home culture and the fall of commercial real estate post-COVID? So I'm happy for anyone to volunteer to answer that question. Yes.
So we're looking at this from two parts. I mean, COVID was a fantastic test. We have Siemens 380,000 employees, and we sent everybody which could, so all the white collars, and I hate saying white and blue collar, but all of the people which could work from home to work from home. So this is, we tenfolded our remote working culture. And we're now thinking, coming back, should we send everybody back to home at the same time? So it's a huge paradigm shift. Now we need to fix those internet connections, which we just have. I mean, Eric, that's one of the things which we should sort of improve. We need good connectivity to be able to make that happen. But besides that, that means that the office, which has been designed for you to have a fixed space to come in and just commute in and out all the time, has to be completely rethought. So at Siemens, we're rethinking this fundamentally. On building now spaces where you're coming together because you want to physically meet, innovate, etc., and you can go home when you need to do work on your own. So it's going to be a very different place where you come to work, you're coming to work to meet and create. And this is what we are trying to sort of redefine. And we're starting with ourselves. We have worked with Salesforce, because Salesforce has a couple of IT capabilities, and saying, look, we're bringing our OT, our sensors, etc., to be able to do this remote working capable, but also doing a completely new redefinition of what a way of working could be in an office space, which is then very differently. So this is a fantastic question because we are doing it ourselves, we're doing it with our partners, but I think this will have a huge impact on real estate and the way actually office buildings are being defined. So COVID taught us that it's possible to do it differently, and now we need to design this new normal into the way we're building spaces at home, but also spaces in the office.
Well, I'm getting the big red flashing light on my screen, which means that sadly I am out of time. I would love to come to the rest of the panel for that question, but unfortunately I can't. But Eric, Marianne, and Cedric, thank you so very much for your time. It's been a fascinating discussion, and we're going to move over to my colleague Stephanie Bodoni, her fellow journalist of mine who is in Luxembourg. And she's going to continue the event on for us from now.
Thanks, Nate. Hello and welcome everyone to the second part of this event. Here joining us on this panel, we have Gus Hossain, who is Executive Director at Privacy International. Hello, Gus.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. Next, we have Stuart Jackson, who is Senior Director EMEA at Blackberry.
Good morning, Stephanie.
Good morning. And last but by no means least, we have Sophie Veld. She is a member of the European Parliament's Liberal group and part of Dutch political party D66. Hello, Sophie.
Good morning.
Good morning. So it's a question with no straightforward answers. Any benefit that you can derive from all sensing infrastructure brings with it the inevitable question of data privacy. How can you strike the right balance between making people's lives easier, safer, more convenient without actually infringing on their data privacy? And that leads me to immediately launch into my first question to the group. We'll probably start with Stuart, because I'm trying to find out what are some of the biggest challenges facing companies that contribute to making cities smarter from a privacy point of view. And do rules such as in the EU you have now, the General Data Protection Regulation, do they make it any tougher in Europe than elsewhere in the world? Stuart, maybe we can start with you, then we go to Gus and Sophie.
Okay, thank you. So I think from my point of view, what we see here in the UK, obviously with the situation just before and after Christmas, which seems like a lifetime ago with coronavirus and the situation we're currently going through was Brexit. And so with Brexit happening and us eventually separating from the EU whenever that happens later this year, or maybe if it's prolonged, what we find is that we have independent states that are also looking at informational data that's traversing our infrastructure, other infrastructures that are going through networks, passing data, passing information, personal information, and corporate data, whatever it might be, where they're actually requesting infrastructures to be held within their country or within EU legislated countries as well. So the scenario we find is even in the current climate, trying to hold or reside data within a country or within a particular bloc such as the EU, is we're trying to maintain that information. So BlackBerry has struggled really, or not struggled, but has been in that scenario where we have to watch what the market's wanting, where data needs to be, how people want to access it, and then we actually need to be able to make access to data available, but also we need to be mindful of, especially in a security context, that people want both things. They want the ability to be completely anonymous, but they also need the ability to be secure. And there is an equilibrium that needs to be struck between the two. Now, the way that we see that within our customers is that we have to be able to say, okay, here is enough information for us to make you secure, but not so much that we know where you are. And that's kind of the equilibrium we have to meet, is we have to be able to reduce what we refer to as friction in a user experience, but ultimately allow you to be, as we say, anonymous.
Mm-hmm. Gus, do you have any insights on what are some of the main challenges from a privacy point of view? I think Privacy International has been looking into this and the whole trend of trying to make cities smarter. What are your views?
Well, we would also like to see smart cities and smart infrastructure, but we have yet to see an example where this has been done well and governed well. If you just look at the most three recent examples, you have Google with Sidewalk Labs in Toronto, eventually pulling out because of all the opposition around data and privacy and governance of that data. We just released a report last week about Huawei in Uganda deploying smart infrastructure involving CCTV on highways. And then last week, it was discovered that the city of San Diego, where it had a smart streetlight infrastructure deployed by the city for environmental purposes and transportation purposes, was being used by the police to monitor protesters. So in all those examples I've given, we've struggled with the data governance problems. And so as we talk about smart cities, all we're talking about is deploying more and more sensors in the world, and we have no mechanism for governing them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Sophie, what are your views? I mean, you're quite opinionated in the European Parliament. You've been following, privacy issues. You've been following this very, very closely over the past few years, and I'm sure you have some thoughts on this issue of having sensors all across people.
Well, first of all, I'm not a big believer in the notion that there has to be a trade-off. And I think what Gus was referring to, this struggle, is not actually between, whether you can develop these systems and still protect our rights, our privacy, and our data. It's more a matter of political will. And we just see that while citizens are very keen on this kind of facilities being developed, we also see that there is an insatiable appetite for personal data with public authorities, and they are notoriously bad at protecting our privacy and our data. We've just had a big scandal in the Netherlands where it turns out that the tax revenue service has been massively using our data for ethnic profiling. So speaking of undermining trust, so I don't believe in that trade-off, and I do think that it is entirely possible, as it was with, let's say, social standards. I mean, there were people who've been arguing that, if you abolish, slavery and child labor, or if you apply environmental standards, then the economy will be dead. Well, none of that happened. It turned out that companies are actually quite smart at innovating in such a way that they incorporate these values. So I think that's going to happen with data privacy as well.
Good. We shall see. I mean, before we move on to the second question, we'll just go to our second audience poll. And the question here is, how big are the risks of all sensing infrastructure leading to data privacy violations? Are they A, significant? Are they B, quite low? Or are they C, is it unclear? Okay, while we wait for the results of the second poll to come in, I'll move to my second question, which is, how big of a consideration actually are privacy rules in plans to establish infrastructure for smart cities? And how much does this question depend on where in the world such plans are being elaborated? Maybe we can go again with Stuart first, given that you haven't spoken in a while.
Okay, no problem. So I think from my point of view, the situation we find ourselves in is that obviously it massively depends on where we are in the world. Obviously, we find ourselves this morning stories of different companies such as TikTok pulling out of Hong Kong as an example because of what they're being requested or information they're being requested by certain governments. I won't go into names, but I think we know who we're referring to. And I think the scenario is that as we find ourselves dependent upon where we are in the world, obviously governs how and where we treat data. And that same is applicable for any contact or whether you're actually promoting a integrated information or infrastructure, that if you're going around and such as the way that we are as a vendor, we actually have information or updates that we are sending over the air for multiple aspects of our infrastructure and products that touch or data that sends information or whatever it might be. And there needs to be a way in which that is sent in a secure fashion. And so then we go back to the point of how do we know that that is an endpoint that is expected? How do we know that when that data or that part of that infrastructure is updated and that information is gathered, how on earth we make sure that someone is separated from the two things? And we need to make sure that that happens. And that's something we've always tried to do, is that if we can identify that something needs updating, well, do we really need to know who the individual is or what's actually going on with that person? Well, not really. There are scenarios where we might want to be able to determine where they are in the world and if that is normal for them. And if it isn't normal, then we need to change the way in which they react with infrastructure. And so that's something that we're exploring right now and how to do that. And we're trying to do it wherever possible without having that data, having that captured and clear to everything we do. We never resell data in that way.
Mm-hmm. Gus, I mean, on this question as well, I mean, how big of a consideration in your view should privacy rules be? And do you see it as an impediment that rules actually differ from country to country?
Well, just to address the question of rules differing, for what it's worth, there's over 100 countries across the world with data protection laws. So there is a relative uniformity around what is expected when it comes to the treatment of data. I think it isn't so much around the laws, but it's around the deployment. And Stuart has raised some really good examples of how you can actually have sensors that don't collect data that would necessarily invoke data protection and privacy laws. But I actually want to reframe the problem to a much larger question: is data being generated, whether it has a name of a person or not, is valuable to somebody. And that's why we're deploying, we're investing and spending the money to deploy these sensors. And it will generate intelligence. And that intelligence can be used to empower people, but it has to be protected from abuse. And that abuse could be the companies that run the infrastructure for the city. It could be from the government itself or other governments or malicious hackers. And what we're talking about when it comes to smart cities is increasing the amount of data that exists in the world at a time when we have, well, to date, we have never secured a valuable data source from anybody. And that's why I remain concerned with regard to the legal frameworks.
Sophie, do you want to chime in on this question as well?
Yes. I have to say I very much share the concern just expressed by Gus. I'm also an optimist, though, and I note that, Gus and I have known each other for a long time, and I remember when I started first to work on privacy issues over 15 years ago, that people thought I was, that I was working on a niche subject that nobody cared about, whereas the awareness of the importance of data protection has risen very, very rapidly, and that helps because it gives some counterweight to this excessive data appetite. Very rapidly on the issue of who's calling the shots. Yes, I'm worried about the growing dependence of the European Union or Europe, the wider Europe, of the United States in particular, and China. I think we rapidly need to invest and eliminate the barriers for European firms. And I think we should use our market power to actually, let's say, propagate and impose our standards rather than being dependent on US or Chinese firms. I think we should also, and Gus already mentioned it, not overlook Africa, where a lot is happening and where the Chinese are extremely active. So I think Europe needs to step up to the plate. Secondly, we have, I think, the best data protection law in the world, but the means that we allocate for enforcement are pathetic, really pathetic. I think the combined budget of all the European data protection authorities equals about the turnover of roughly a week of Facebook. That's ridiculous. And then thirdly, I think maybe we should envisage, very much like we have the Paris Climate Agreement. maybe we should envisage a worldwide agreement on data protection and privacy. And I know there are many alliances and we have national laws, but something that would give it the visibility and the weight which the Paris Agreement has, and also make it binding when we are going to conclude international trade agreements.
Thank you, Sophie. We'll have a couple more questions quickly, but I just would like to go to the results of the poll. They should come up in the slide. There we go. So how big are the risks of all sensing infrastructure leading to data protection violations? It seems that 64 people, 72% think they are significant. 4% think they're low, and 22% say it's unclear. There we go. That leads me to a very quick question to the panel one more time. Really quite an easy one. How excited or concerned are you about this idea of having smart city infrastructure all around you? And is it really, and that's the key question of our panel, is it really possible to strike the right balance between allowing people to draw the benefits of this, but at the same time not having their data privacy infringed? Sophie, I'll let you go first this time.
I think it is possible. It can be done, but it requires political will. It requires a strict enforcement of the principles we have laid down in legislation, and we also need to give the right incentives to companies, for example, but also to, for example, local authorities to develop the right systems. And the biggest remaining concern that I have is that governments are always a bit duplicit about this, because on the one hand they're propagating data protection. And they're cracking down on companies. At the same time, they're very eager for their intelligence services to get access to this, wealth of personal data for surveillance purposes. And this is something where I think people need to be a lot more aware. But can it be done? Yes, it can.
Mm-hmm. Gus, maybe a very quick 30-second answer.
It's other than I completely agree with Sophie, as I have often in my career. One opportunity we have is to make sure that the smart city is open. That is, at every juncture, you will find, as Sophie says, intelligence agencies, police agencies will want to have privileged access to the smart city. Can we build a smart city where nobody has privileged access, where everybody has access to the sensors? And that, I think, will govern a much more careful deployment of sensors that is genuinely useful to people and not just authorities.
Mm-hmm. Stuart, a quick one before we move to one last question from the audience.
Sure. So I echo the comments that's been said already, and I believe that it's the governments that will drive how far people will try to go. So if at the end of the day, if you're given a long enough lead to be able to do whatever you want, then obviously you will try and repurpose that data in any way that makes, unfortunately, the most economic sense. That's what you're going to find. So it is the governments that have to drive that mandate to say, no, this is as far as you're allowed to go. However, on the story of smart cities, and does it make sense? Absolutely, it makes sense. The intention of making the places safer, more secure, for people just to be able to walk around and understand what's going on and be able to get that information, that clearly makes sense. And yes, I believe it can be done.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have one question from the audience that came in. I don't have a name with it, but I'll read it out quickly. How will supply chains, workflow, connectivity, and security change in the future? Who wants to go first?
So I think I can have a go.
Stuart, go ahead.
I can have a go. I think obviously the interaction of every part of a smart city or a supply chain or a flow, whatever it might be, that actually takes part of deploying and feeding a city, which is ultimately what we're referring to here. It's already in progress. We're already seeing that robots are now delivering our parcels, as an example. So we're seeing this information happen. We're seeing integration of cars coming in, autonomous driving. The products that we supply is sat within 175 million cars on the road today with autonomous driving and various other aspects of driving security. So we know safety. So we know that that's already happening. And we will see that it will exponentially grow as the Internet of Things, which is a popular coin phrase, will become even more widely deployed.
Mm-hmm. Does
I think the question is maybe tugging at the strings around the Huawei controversy, which is we used to live in a world where you would buy technology that does a certain thing, you deploy that, and a certain thing would result. And now we're starting, whether it's because of political issues or geopolitical issues or purely technical issues, we're starting to question what's actually going on beneath the surface. Is this technology serving the interests of the person who's buying and deploying the technology, or is it serving the interests of somebody else, say, for example, the Chinese government? And now that we're starting to question the provenance of our technologies, and for national security reasons, governments are starting to pick it apart, I think that we're going to be much more skeptical. That would be a good thing if we're more skeptical about the technologies we're deploying and whose interests are being served. I actually worry instead we're going to be much more paranoid about the technology, and that doesn't end us in a good place.
Mm-hmm. Sophie, your last words on how will everything?
Yeah, well, I'm neither a tech expert nor a clairvoyant, who's to say, but I think again, if we make sure that we solve the data protection issue and the privacy issue, then it offers great opportunities. I'm thinking of, my country being, first of all, one of the most densely populated countries in the world, and also a country where everybody massively moves around by bicycle. In the aftermath of the corona crisis, they now have to rearrange the traffic lights for cyclists at very busy crossings in big cities. But that at the same time allows for more people to move around safely and freely. So that's the kind of smart solutions I think people will embrace. So I think there are endless opportunities, and I do think that we can solve the other issues. We can do it fully respecting our values.
There's so much more to discuss on this topic, but we've run out of time. Thank you so much to our panelists. We've had some great insights there. I will have to hand it back to Nate, who will be joined by our colleague from Bloomberg Intelligence. Thank you very much, Sophie. Thank you, Gus. Thank you, Stuart, for joining us today. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Fascinating panel. Now, we have a very exciting element to the program next. I'm going to be speaking with my colleague from Bloomberg Intelligence, Sonia Baldera, who is currently in Lisbon. Sonia is a senior analyst for infrastructure and building at Bloomberg Intelligence. Welcome, Sonia.
Hello. Good morning.
Good morning. Now, at the very top of this this panel, when I sounded really smart talking about air pollution levels and sensors, it's because I was reading something that Sonia had written. So safe to say, she's definitely set the tone by proxy of me for this entire session. But Sonia, I wanted to ask you something that I asked the panel initially, which is that we've been talking about smart cities and the smart city revolution for years, but I do sort of feel anecdotally like we are coming into contact with more sensors than ever in our buildings. Do you think we've passed a turning point in that regard?
Nate, I think we are at a tipping point right now. So I think what we have seen so far in the past years is not responding to the needs that actually all the regions have in terms of urbanization demand. So if I just try to assess the number of projects that I've been seeing in the past 15 years and what amount of money this has, so I see a lot of disappointment. There is definitely a lot of efforts that have been done in terms of promoting these projects, but not enough to respond to the demand for the biggest centers. So I'm not only speaking about brownfield, for example, in some of the biggest cities in Europe, but as well greenfield or projects done from scratch in other geographies and developing countries, namely India. So overall, I think from my perspective, there is a lot of investment and business opportunity attached. And this is not only sensors, Nate. This is pretty much across all the sectors, from technology, telecommunications, building, infrastructure, building materials. So, and these can be at a micro and macro level. So if I try to balance what we have seen and what we have to deliver, I think we are living in days of disconnect that needs to be solved right now.
So what are the financial considerations are there behind putting together buildings with billions of sensors? I mean, we've touched on financial considerations a bit so far, but maybe you could expand a little bit on what some of the challenges are there, or who should be spending more.
Right. So I would say that in terms of financing, what I've been seeing so far is really it's hard to find projects that are bankable. What I mean with this, basically, you have key stakeholders on these projects, some pushing the social return, others pushing the economic return. So, and has been very difficult to find a balance between this type of stakeholders. The other block of complexity that I see in the past was related with regulation. So we have heard a lot about regulation today, but I still think there's a lot to be done. That's what I felt from the companies that I cover that are providing some of these infrastructure projects globally, is that we have to find a consensus in terms of regulation. And I really like the idea from Sophie today to have like a broad approach, a global approach to these at data protection levels. So I would just namely these two blocks of conditions. So in terms of who should invest, who should finance these, definitely it is a balance of public money plus private money. I see more will for some equity stakeholders to put money. For example, hedge funds that are really eager to put money on these projects. So more PPPs need to be done. And above all, we need to look at these projects not only by silos, as Cedric said, but we need to have a broader view of in the connectivity of all these systems integrated. And if we do that, probably the risk of these projects will be more clean, and we have more bankable approach and better financing to find it.
Okay, well, just finally, we've got a couple of minutes. Maybe you could give us a few reasons why, let's say, the execution of smart cities could be regarded differently now, given the new normal of times that we currently live in. And also, maybe you could touch a little bit about some of the regional opportunities here between Europe, the Americas, Latin America, Africa, and so forth.
Right. So in terms of the reasons, and I'm glad that the poll results is really in the direction to what I believe. So three main reasons. I think we are living at a mindset difference right now. So I think the smart cities concept is the only way to avert some of the big challenges that we are facing nowadays. So climate change, air pollution, inequality. So this is one of the first reason. The second reason is that the control and data give us access to more visibility over the projects, and we might have good decisions because actually we can see the impact, the social impact and the economic impact of these projects. And third, more money into the table. So I can see that there is a more goodwill and openness from the government side to approach and finance some of these projects. I give you the example of what we have seen so far in terms of the European Union Green Deal or the UK New Deal. So more money, more fiscal stimulus is being put on these projects. In terms of the regional breakdown, I would say that definitely brownfield in Europe will concentrate probably the biggest chunk of projects in the coming years. China or Asia will be concentrated totally on China. And in terms of US, they have tried to catch up. I think they need to do more efforts in terms of policy. So a green vision on their policy is really important. And in terms of the other regions, Latin America might be the poorest region to execute some of these projects due to the economic conditions coming from the COVID-19.
Well, Sonia, thank you. We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, because we are out of time. But thanks so much for your remarks. And for anybody else who's preparing and writing opening remarks for a conference soon on this topic, I do strongly recommend pulling up Sonia's writing on Bloomberg Intelligence on the Bloomberg terminal if you have it. She does make it very easy to sound extremely smart when constructing those remarks. So thank you, Sonia, again.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of our speakers, of course, for joining us today. We're extremely grateful for your participation and your perspective, and also to our audience, both within and beyond the Bloomberg community. Thanks for joining us. You can get updates and much more, of course, using @Bloomberg Live, and you can find us on LinkedIn, on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and obviously BloombergLive.com is the place to go to see more about other upcoming events that we are hosting. Thank you again to our sponsor, Siemens, and everyone who joined us today. And don't forget, you can watch this on demand on the Bloomberg terminal and later online as well. Thank you all ever so much, and stay well.